Here is something that will change how you think about ancient history forever. Right now, in northern Ethiopia, there are stone obelisks standing over 100 feet tall. Some of them are still standing, some of them have fallen, but all of them were carved, transported, and raised by human hands, without machines, without cranes, without modern engineering, over 3,000 years ago. These are not ruins from a forgotten tribe. These are not the remnants of a small regional kingdom. These obelisks are the calling cards of one of the most powerful empires the ancient world ever produced. And the woman who helped build that empire, the queen whose name is recorded in the Bible, in the Quran, in ancient Ethiopian texts, in African oral tradition, that woman has been quietly, systematically removed from the mainstream history conversation. Her name is Makeda, and depending on where you grew up, you may have never heard that name once in your entire life. But here is what is fascinating. Almost everyone has heard of the Queen of Sheba, the mysterious queen who traveled to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon, the queen described in the Bible as arriving with unimaginable wealth, spices, gold, precious stones, in quantities so large that there was no more such abundance of spices as these which the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. You have heard that story. Most people have, but very few people know her actual name, and even fewer people know that the kingdom she ruled was a real, documented, archaeologically verified empire, not a myth, not a legend, not a fairy tale, and that the dynasty she founded lasted in an unbroken line of succession for nearly 3,000 years. So the question we are going to explore today is simple. Why does the Western world know the story, but not the queen? Why do textbooks give us the tale, but erase the woman? And what exactly did Makeda build that someone, at some point in history, decided the world should not fully understand? Stay with me, because this story is not what you were taught. To understand Makeda, you have to understand the world she was born into. It is the 10th century before the Common Era. The region we now call the Horn of Africa, modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, sits at one of the most strategically important crossroads on Earth. To the east, the Red Sea connects Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. To the north, ancient trade routes push toward Egypt and the Mediterranean. To the south, the interior of the African continent stretches for thousands of miles, rich with resources that the ancient world desperately wanted: gold, ivory, incense, and livestock. The city of Axum, spelled Axum, is not just a city at this point in history. It is the center of a growing empire. And that empire controls something more valuable than any single resource. It controls the roots. Whoever sits in Axum controls who trades what, with whom, and at what price. This is the world Makeda inherits, and the question historians and archaeologists have wrestled with for over a century is this: what exactly was the religious and cultural identity of the people who built Axum? And this is where the conversation gets genuinely complex and genuinely contested. The Ge'ez language, the ancient written language of Axum, contains structures, root words, and grammatical patterns that show a deep connection to ancient Semitic languages. Not borrowed, not imported, structural, foundational. Linguists who have studied Ge'ez in depth describe it as a Semitic language that developed in parallel with ancient Hebrew and Aramaic, sharing a common ancestor but branching into its own distinct form. Now, think about what that means. The ancient Axumites and the ancient Hebrews shared the same foundational language family. What does that tell us about who these people actually were? Leave your answer in the comments, because this is genuinely one of the most debated questions in African historical scholarship today. There is a text at the center of this story that most Western audiences have never encountered. It is called the Kebra Nagast. In the ancient Ge'ez language, those words translate directly to the glory of kings. The Kebra Nagast is not a short document. It is a long, detailed, structured royal chronicle, compiled and preserved by Ethiopian scholars and priests across many centuries, drawing on even older oral and written traditions. It is, in many ways, the founding document of Ethiopian royal identity, and it makes a very specific, very detailed, and very bold claim. It says that the royal bloodline of Ethiopia descends directly from a union between Queen Makeda, ruler of the ancient kingdom of Axum, and King Solomon of Israel. According to the Kebra Nagast, Makeda traveled to Jerusalem. She spent time in Solomon's court. She was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and resources, and Solomon, by any account, was regarded as the wisest and wealthiest king of his era. The two formed a deep connection. When Makeda returned to Ethiopia, she was carrying Solomon's child. That child was born. He was given the name Menelik, and Menelik, when he grew to adulthood, made his own journey back to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon received him, recognized him, and according to the Kebra Nagast, Menelik returned to Ethiopia, carrying with him the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred container holding the stone tablets on which the Ten Commandments were written. Now, let us be precise here, because precision matters in this conversation. The Kebra Nagast is a religious and royal chronicle. It is a document that serves a specific purpose, establishing the divine legitimacy of the Ethiopian monarchy. That is its function. That is its context. But here is what scholars frequently overlook when they dismiss the Kebra Nagast as purely mythological. Royal chronicles from this era across many ancient cultures consistently blend what we would today separate into historical fact and religious narrative. The Iliad contains real geographical locations. Egyptian royal inscriptions contain real military records wrapped in divine language. The presence of religious framing does not automatically disqualify the historical core of a document, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which has maintained custody of these traditions for over 1,700 years, does not treat the Kebra Nagast as allegory. They treat it as history. So here is the real question. When a Western scholar in the 19th century looked at the Kebra Nagast and said, "This is just a myth," what exactly was that judgment based on? Archaeological investigation, linguistic analysis, or assumption? Let us talk about what exists in the physical world, because archaeology does not care about assumptions. The ancient city of Axum, in what is now the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia, contains one of the most remarkable concentrations of ancient monumental architecture anywhere on the African continent. The stelae, those massive carved stone obelisks, are the most visible evidence. Some of them reach over 20 meters in height. The largest one ever erected is believed to have stood over 30 meters tall before it fell. For comparison, that is roughly the height of a 10-story building. These stelae are not random religious monuments. They are carved with architectural details, false windows, false doors, that mirror the design language of multi-story palatial buildings. In other words, the people who made them were communicating something specific about the buildings they lived and worshipped in. And those buildings have also been found. Excavations at a site called Dungur, located just outside the modern city of Axum, uncovered the remains of a massive ancient palace complex. The structure is sometimes called the Palace of the Queen of Sheba by local tradition, though archaeologists are careful to note that direct attribution to Makeda herself is not conclusively established. What is established is that the palace dates to a period consistent with the historical timeline of Axum's early imperial phase, and that it was an enormous, sophisticated structure, covering an area of roughly 3,600 square meters, with dozens of rooms, stone-paved floors, and a layout that reflects advanced architectural planning. When European archaeologists began seriously excavating Axum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the findings they uncovered, by any objective measure, were extraordinary. Ancient inscriptions in multiple languages, Ge'ez, ancient South Arabian script, and Greek, were found on the same monuments. This trilingual presence tells us something crucial. It tells us that Axum was not an isolated regional power. It was an empire with international diplomatic reach, using multiple languages because it was dealing with multiple major civilizations simultaneously. And yet, the dominant academic narrative that emerged from this era described Axum primarily through the lens of outside influence. The Sabaean hypothesis, the idea that Axum's culture was primarily derived from migrants crossing from the Arabian Peninsula, became the default framework. Ethiopian scholars and African historians pushing back on this framework were marginalized. Their arguments were not engaged with seriously, they were simply set aside. Why does this matter? Because if Axum civilization is primarily derivative, a copy of Arabian or Mediterranean cultures, then it does not challenge the existing hierarchy of ancient world history. But if Axum is an independent, indigenous African civilization with its own Semitic linguistic roots and its own sophisticated royal and religious traditions, that is a very different story. And that different story has a woman at its center. Here's a pattern worth examining carefully, not with anger, with analysis. In the 19th century, when European imperial powers were actively colonizing and partitioning the African continent, there was a parallel academic project happening. Historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists were constructing a framework for understanding African history, and that framework consistently minimized, externalized, or ignored evidence of advanced African civilizations. Great Zimbabwe, the massive stone city complex in southern Africa, was attributed by early European researchers to Phoenicians, Arabs, anyone but indigenous Africans. Benin City's sophisticated bronze casting was described as impossible without outside instruction. Egyptian civilization was for much of mainstream European scholarship discussed as essentially separate from the rest of Africa. Axum fits this exact same pattern. The linguistic evidence connecting Axumite culture to ancient Semitic traditions was acknowledged, but then attributed to migration from the Arabian Peninsula rather than to indigenous development. The architectural sophistication was acknowledged, but framed as exceptional, unusual, a departure from what Africa normally produced. The royal chronicles, like the Kebra Nagast, were read as religious mythology rather than as historical documents deserving serious analysis. And the result of this pattern is that by the time most Western-educated students encounter the Queen of Sheba story, they encounter it as a Bible story, a fairy tale, a legend, not as the founding narrative of a real empire that left physical evidence across thousands of square miles of African landscape. Ask yourself this honestly. If the Kebra Nagast had been discovered in Greece and described a Greek queen founding a dynasty that lasted 3,000 years, would scholars have called it mythology, or would they have called it history? That is not a rhetorical trap. It is a genuine methodological question, and it deserves a genuine answer. Here is the part of the story that is, in many ways, the most remarkable and the most difficult to dismiss. The dynasty that the Kebra Nagast attributes to Makeda and Solomon, the Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopian emperors, did not last a generation, it did not last a century. According to historical records, it lasted in some form for approximately 3,000 years. Let that number sit for a moment. 3,000 years. The Roman Empire, at its peak, lasted roughly 500 years before its western half collapsed. The Byzantine Empire lasted roughly another 1,000 years. The Ottoman Empire lasted approximately 600 years. The British Empire, in its formal colonial phase, lasted roughly 300 years. The Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia, tracing its lineage directly to Makeda through her son Menelik, is documented in royal chronicles from the 10th century BCE all the way to the 20th century CE. The last emperor to formally hold this title was Haile Selassie, who ruled Ethiopia until 1974. Haile Selassie's full imperial title included the phrase "conquering lion of the tribe of Judah," a direct reference to the Hebrew tribal identity that the Ethiopian royal house maintained as its foundational claim for 3 millennia. Now, this is not a claim made only by Ethiopian tradition. This dynastic continuity is acknowledged by mainstream historians. The debate is not about whether the dynasty existed. The debate is about what it means. Is the Solomonic dynasty proof that Makeda's union with Solomon was historical? Some scholars say yes. Others argue that the dynasty adopted the Solomonic narrative at a later point in history to legitimize its rule. This is a genuine scholarly debate with real evidence on multiple sides. But here is what is not debated. An African kingdom, based in what is now Ethiopia, maintained an unbroken royal tradition with explicit Hebrew identity claims for roughly 3,000 years. That is documented. That is physical. That is in the historical record. And somehow, that story does not appear in most Western high school history curricula. Why? That question alone is worth an entire comment section. Go ahead, tell me what you think. There is a church in the city of Axum that sits at the center of one of the most extraordinary claims in all of African history. It is called the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. It is an ancient site. The current structure is a reconstruction built over earlier foundations that go back many centuries, and it is one of the most sacred locations in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition. Inside this church complex, in a small chapel called the Chapel of the Tablet, there is a guardian, a single monk selected for life who lives inside the chapel and never leaves. He is given food and supplies from outside. He will die inside the chapel. His entire existence, from the moment of his selection until the moment of his death, is devoted to one purpose: guarding what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims is the original Ark of the Covenant. Let us be precise again, because precision is everything here. No outside researcher, no archaeologist, no journalist, no foreign dignitary has ever been permitted to examine or verify the object inside that chapel. The Ethiopian Church does not offer proof. It does not seek outside validation. It makes a claim, and it guards it, and it has been doing so for well over 1,000 years of documented history. From a purely historical methodology standpoint, this means the Ark claim cannot be confirmed. But here is the other side of that coin. It also cannot be dismissed simply because it is inconvenient. What can be said is this: the practice of housing a replica of the Ark, called a tabot, in every Ethiopian Orthodox church in the country is one of the most distinctive features of Ethiopian Christianity. Every church in Ethiopia has one. The tabot is the sacred center of the liturgy. It is carried in processions. It is treated with the same reverence that the original Ark was treated in ancient Hebrew tradition. This practice did not begin in the 20th century. It did not begin in the medieval period. The earliest written documentation of this practice pushes back well over 1,000 years, and oral tradition pushes it further back still, into the pre-Christian era, when Axum practiced what scholars describe as a form of monotheism that shares structural elements with ancient Hebrew religious practice. The connection between ancient Ethiopia and ancient Hebrew religion is not a fringe theory. It is a mainstream observation in the field of comparative religious studies. The only question is what that connection means and how far back it goes.
here is where this conversation becomes most historically significant. The claim at the heart of the Kebra Nagast and at the heart of Ethiopian royal and religious tradition is not simply that Makeda was a powerful queen. It is that Makeda and her descendants were part of the same Hebrew heritage that produced the kings and prophets recorded in ancient scripture. In other words, the Ethiopian tradition does not position itself as influenced by Hebrew culture. It positions itself as Hebrew culture, as one of its original and most continuous expressions. This is a claim that has enormous implications because, if true, or even if substantially historically grounded, it means that one of the most enduring Hebrew royal dynasties in history was African, based in Africa, ruled by Africans, maintained by Africans for 3,000 years. And that is a story that does not fit cleanly into the frameworks that most Western audiences were given for understanding both African history and the history of ancient monotheistic traditions. Now, is this claim accepted by mainstream scholarship? No, not in its full form. There are serious historians who argue that the Solomonic connection was a later political construction. There are equally serious historians who argue that the linguistic and archaeological evidence supports a genuinely ancient Hebrew-African connection that predates the construction. What is not acceptable from a purely methodological standpoint is simply assuming the claim is false because it is African. That is not analysis. That is bias. And the distinction between those two things, analysis and bias, is exactly what this channel is about.
Let us talk about the 19th and 20th century European archaeological work in Axum directly, because the story of how that scholarship was conducted is itself a story about erasure. When the Deutsche Axum Expedition, a German archaeological team, conducted their landmark survey of Axum in 1906, they produced detailed documentation of the stelae, the inscriptions, the palace ruins, and the surrounding sites. Their work was genuinely valuable. It preserved records of monuments that subsequent decades of conflict and neglect damaged significantly. But their interpretive framework, the lens through which they analyzed what they found, was shaped entirely by the assumption that sophisticated African civilization required external origin. The Sabaean hypothesis was not a conclusion they reached from the evidence. It was an assumption they brought with them, and the evidence was then interpreted to fit that assumption. Ethiopian scholars, Ethiopian Orthodox priests, and African historians who offered alternative frameworks were not invited into this process. Their texts, the Kebra Nagast, the royal chronicles, the oral histories, were treated as religious literature rather than historical sources. This methodological choice had consequences that lasted for decades. An entire generation of Western-educated students learned about the ancient world without ever hearing the name Axum. And the scholars who did discuss Axum consistently framed it as a peripheral player, an empire on the edges of the real ancient world, rather than as a major civilization in its own right. The correction of this framing has been slow. It is still happening. African scholars, Ethiopian historians, and a growing number of Western archaeologists are pushing for a more honest engagement with the evidence. That work matters. And it matters partly because the story of Makeda, of a black African queen who built one of the ancient world's great empires and whose dynasty lasted 3,000 years, is a story with real consequences for how people understand both history and themselves. We started with a simple observation. Almost everyone knows the name Cleopatra. Very few people know the name Makeda. Let us sit with that contrast for a moment, not emotionally, but analytically. Cleopatra ruled Egypt from approximately 51 BCE to 30 BCE. Her reign lasted roughly 21 years. She was brilliant, politically sophisticated, and historically significant. She is also one of the most written about figures in all of ancient history. Makeda, according to the historical framework we have been examining, ruled a kingdom that controlled one of the most important trade corridors in the ancient world. Her dynasty, by the accounting of the Ethiopian royal tradition and the Kebra Nagast, produced a 3,000-year lineage of kings and emperors. The physical evidence of her civilization, the stelae, the palace ruins, the trilingual inscriptions, the continuous religious tradition, is still standing, still visible, still being studied today. By any objective measure of historical significance, duration of dynasty, geographic reach, architectural achievement, continuity of cultural tradition, the story of Makeda and Axum is at least the equal of Cleopatra's Egypt, arguably larger, arguably longer lasting, arguably more continuously documented. And yet Cleopatra has movies. Cleopatra has textbook chapters. Cleopatra has a name that every 10-year-old on Earth has heard. Makeda has, in most Western educational settings, nothing. Now, you can explain that gap in various ways. You can say it is simply a matter of which historical sources Western scholars had access to. You can say it reflects the geographic and cultural biases of the academic institutions that shaped the curriculum. You can say it is the result of the same pattern we discussed earlier, the pattern of minimizing, externalizing, and erasing evidence of advanced African civilizations. All of those explanations are probably partly true, and none of them make the gap acceptable, because here is what we know for certain. There are obelisks in northern Ethiopia that have been standing for 3,000 years. There is a palace complex outside the city of Axum whose foundations stretch back to the era described in the Kebra Nagast. There is a church that claims custody of the most sacred object in the Hebrew tradition. There is a language, Gez, with Semitic roots that predate the arrival of any outside influence. There is a dynasty that maintained its identity for 3 millennia, and at the beginning of all of that, there is a woman, a queen, a ruler whose name, according to the oldest Ethiopian traditions, was Makeda. Not a myth, not a Bible story, a queen. The empire she helped build left ruins that tourists visit today. The dynasty she founded left records that historians still debate today. The religious tradition she is credited with shaping left a church that stands in her city today. So here is the final question we're going to leave you with. Why does the Western world know the story of the Queen of Sheba, but not the name of the queen? That question does not have a simple answer, but it has a real one, and figuring out that answer together is exactly what this channel is for. If this empire was a legend, why is her palace still standing today? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you think the name Makeda belongs in every history textbook alongside Cleopatra, share this video with someone who has never heard that name, because the first step to correcting history is knowing what was left out. Subscribe, and we'll keep looking.